And take it away.
Okay, sure. Well, welcome everyone. It's always good to be an honorary Hazak member for the evening, and welcome you back for, like Phil said, the third installment. I think all of you know Dr. Kahn at this point, and I'm sure Dr. Meiches as well. So we can probably jump right into the discussion tonight on where we are with COVID, vaccines, variants, and all the rest. And I think Mark will be our moderator, and he'll help us through the Q&A when we get to that point. And I will turn it over to him first. And thank you, by the way, again, for doing this, Mark and Jeff.
Our pleasure. It's our pleasure. I know I speak for Jeff. Thank Phil and Hazak again for inviting us and for providing this information to everybody. A couple of quick housekeeping things. Once again, we're going to ask you all to send your questions to me, and I will try to field them all. One thing, we've already got a bunch of questions taken in, and a lot of them pertain to very specific things. Can I do this? Can I do that? Can I do that? We are going to address those, and we're going to address more broadly some parameters. So try not to give us too many questions about specific things, because we will give you some broad parameters about what you can and can't do moving forward. And also, I've asked Dan to send you two links. They're both from the CDC. One is basically about what you can do now if you are vaccinated out in the real world. And the other one is what can you do if you want to travel, whether you're vaccinated or not. And they're excellent links, very easy to read about what you should or should be doing according at least to the CDC. So please use those. Those are excellent resources. Other than that, I'm going to turn it back over to Jeff. And then after that, we've got a series of questions to go over and some other subjects. So once again, Jeff Kahn, as you all know, is the Chief of Pediatric Infectious Disease at Southwestern, and he is the de facto guru for Anshai, Torah, and so much more of our community. So Jeff, welcome, and thank you again.
Thank you, Mark. I have actually a short presentation here. So I'm going to share my screen here, and let me know if you can see my screen.
Yes.
Okay, so I'll go ahead and get started here. So welcome everybody. Thanks for logging on tonight. I want to give everybody sort of the 30,000-foot view of what COVID is, where we are with COVID right now. So this is data from the Johns Hopkins dashboard, looking at confirmed cases, new cases in the United States, going back from to March 2020 to actually April 2021, just a few days ago. And you can see here's the curve, and there was a small peak in the spring of last year, a larger peak during the summer, and of course a very large peak during the winter months. And you can see we're coming off this very large peak here. We've been sort of up and down over the last several weeks, and I'll just remind everybody just to take a look at this. Look at the shape of this curve here. This, by the way, this dark orange line is the 7-day rolling average. So this is a pretty good indication of where we are. And here's some statistics as of yesterday. 30 million infections in the United States, 555,000 deaths. And as we stand now, at least as far as yesterday is concerned, 1 in every 597 Americans have died of COVID-19. Really astonishing numbers. Here's some data from other countries, and I put these three up because these countries actually had troubles with COVID before we did. And each of these countries, France, Italy, and Germany, again, very similar graphs, confirmed cases over time, are starting to struggle. You can see in France, they're having a very large additional peak now, which is almost rivaling their first peak. They're in a lockdown. Italy, again, coming off this second large wave. In Germany, again, after a pretty quiescent period here, a peak here and another peak here. So it just does to suggest that there are concerns out there. We're certainly not out of the woods yet. So here's also data from Johns Hopkins website, and this is really a nice graphic about looking at trends. So each of the states in the United States is represented by one of these tiles. All the states that I have are represented by a red hue, indicate that there's an upward trend in the number of COVID cases. Those in the green hue are a downward trend. So you can see right now, this is just a general overview, about half of the states are actually in an upward trend of COVID. Now this is based on 7-day averages, rolling averages. This tends to change pretty quickly. It's quite dynamic. When I showed this data to another group last week, New York was very red. Now it's turned to green. So there's going to be up and downs, even though we have the vaccine rollout. There are going to be up and downs as we continue to move through the pandemic. But this is a cautionary tale that there's still places in this country and maybe here in the next while that may see an uptick in cases. So here's Texas, and again, as of April 5th, looking at our state's COVID cases, and again, we had a large peak in the summer. Things quieted down a little bit. We hit a high peak, or at least the highest 7-day rolling average was on January 12th, and fortunately, we've really come down quite a bit. Now, I just want to point out one thing also about this graph is that right now in Texas, we're about at 3,500 cases per day. And what I'll show you in a moment is that in Dallas County, during the peak of our activity, we were at 3,500 cases per day. So now the state of Texas has been reduced to amount that was the peak in Dallas County. All right, so here's the data from Dallas County. And again, looking from March of last year up to April of this year, again, a peak in July and August, a very peak in December and January, and we're really on a downward trend here. So this is actually very, very good news. Now, just to show you the impact that COVID-19 has had, at least in Dallas County, here's a slide taken which represents the 15 leading causes of death in Dallas County. And this was data from exactly 1 year ago. So April 6, 2020, you can see the 15 leading causes of death in Dallas County. At that time, on that date, there were 19 deaths due to COVID, exactly 1 year ago today. As of March 21st, 2021, now COVID is the leading cause of death in Dallas County. Really quite astonishing. Passing heart disease, cancer, stroke, accidents, and so on and so forth. But really, this is quite sobering. Here's some data from UT Southwestern, my colleagues at UT Southwestern, and it's really interesting modeling data. So I want to show you on this graph here, it goes from August of last year to actually projected into May. And this actually is occupied beds, occupied hospital beds with COVID patients. The black squares are actually the real data. And you could see coming off the August peak, there was a drop, and then we had a very big peak just about the turn of the new year. And then the numbers started dropping. This blue line here is what was projected 2 weeks prior. So you can see the modeling actually overlies the actual data quite well. And so keep that in mind. So here are two modeling projections. And I'll focus your attention on the bottom here. And again, there are four modeling projections here. The red is if we just start behaving as a society in unmitigated terms. In other words, if we go back to pre-COVID, and you could see that if we have the same volume of vaccine doses, and we throw away all of our social distancing and mask wearing, we're going to see another peak of hospitalizations. Here on the right is the same data, but this is with optimal vaccinations by June 30th. There will still be a peak of hospitalizations, albeit much less than this. But the important thing to note is that there are other lines here, orange, green, and blue, and these all have to do with different degrees of social measures, masks, social distancing, et cetera, et cetera. And for the most part, these are downtrending. So it really speaks to the fact that we have to keep up all these behaviors. And again, here are the bullet points up top. Without any modification of behavior, our COVID-19 hospitalizations could still surpass previous records, even in an ideal vaccination scenario. And again, reverting to behaviors of June, July 2020, before mask mandates went into effect, without a noticeable increase in vaccination volume will lead to increases in hospitalization. So this is, again, is just from our expert modelers at UT Southwestern to show you that we really have to be very, very careful with how we proceed over the next weeks to months.
Let me ask you a question right now, real
Sure.
quick, pertaining to that. I think it pertains to your graphs. a lot of the headlines in the paper have recently been about this concerns about a fourth wave. Is that simply because basically of these graphs that if we don't keep it up, something's going to change, or are there other concerns that are a factor?
Well, I think it has to do mostly with the former, that if we don't keep up our efforts to keep the virus at bay, we're going to see another peak of activity. Of course, the wild card in this is the variants, which I'll talk about in a moment. But these models have been quite accurate over time. And so there's a real concern that if we throw away our mask and start behaving as we did prior to the pandemic, that we're going to see another significant wave. And again, with about half of the states in the United States showing an increase in cases, that's a cautionary tale.
Thank you.
All right, so let's just very briefly talk about the variants. And the three variants, and again, this is data taken from the CDC website. It was updated yesterday. The three variants that have gotten the most attention, and there are others out there, by the way, are the UK variant, otherwise known as the B117, the South African variant, the B1351, and a Brazilian variant, P1. And each of these maps below, I took from the CDC website just today. And again, this map shows you the states where the UK variant is circulating. The middle panel are the states that the South African variant is circulating. And the one on the right is the map of where the Brazilian variant is circulating. And you can see each one of these, Texas is lighting up. And in fact, in Dallas County, we've had cases of the UK variant. And I wouldn't be surprised if the other two variants are in fact circulating. So this is sort of the wild card here. These variants are out there. In fact, they would probably been floating under our radar for quite some time because our sequencing or looking for these variants really hadn't been robust up until the last month or so. So what about the variants in the vaccines? Do the vaccines work against the variants? And there are sort of two ways to look at this. One way is to take a bunch of people who've been vaccinated, take some blood from them, and see how well their blood neutralizes virus in the test tube. And there are a number of studies that have looked at this because that's relatively easy to do. And there's been some consistent results, some inconsistent results, some concerning results that say that the blood neutralizing titer, if you will, against some of the variants isn't as good as against the ancestral strains. But I think a better way to look at this is actually looking at how the vaccines are working in real life. So here's a report from the CDC looking at the two vaccines, that Pfizer and Moderna. And this is actually looking at healthcare workers. And notice the time period where this was examined. This is December 2020 to March 2021. So this is a time period where clearly the variants were circulating. And here's the data, and it's a pretty thick data, but I really want to point out just this here. And you can see that the effectiveness of the vaccines in fully immunized individuals 14 days after the second dose is 91% or 90% based on the statistical analysis used. So this is really consistent with the clinical trials that show that these vaccines had efficacies of 94 to 95%. So what this speaks to me is that here we are looking at the effectiveness of vaccines in real world settings where clearly the variants are circulating. And again, this is very, very good news to suggest that these vaccines protect against the variants. Now, of course, in this study, they didn't go through the detailed analysis to see which viruses were actually circulating at the time, but these are 8 locations in the United States, and I suspect that the variants were circulating in these areas. Here's data, and I'm going to get to the end here. So this is actually data from the Johnson & Johnson vaccine trial. This was data that was actually presented to the FDA and was the basis for their emergency use authorization. And I want to point out a few things. Now, mind you, the J&J vaccine trial was done much later than the Pfizer vaccine trial and the Moderna vaccine trial. Pfizer and Moderna were actually done mostly last summer before the emergence or widespread circulation of the variants. But the Johnson & Johnson vaccine trial was actually done during times where these variants were circulating. And you can see there were 3 countries where the vaccine trials were performed. And what I highlight here is how the vaccine protected against severe and critical disease. And you could see here you could see here that the efficacy of the Johnson & Johnson vaccine in the United States was about 86%, so pretty close to Moderna and Pfizer. South Africa, the experience in South Africa, about 82%. Still, that's pretty good when you think about the efficacy of the yearly flu vaccine. You know, we're happy when we have a flu vaccine that's 50% effective. 60% would be extraordinary. There are years where it's 30%. But here, I mean, this is really good numbers. Look at Brazil, again, about 88%. Now, why is this important? Because one of the things that Johnson & Johnson did in the vaccine trial was actually look at the viruses that were circulating. And here's that data. So in the United States, it was 96% was this, what we call the Wuhan variant. This was the sort of the ancestral strain. In South Africa, 94% or 95% of the viruses circulating there was actually the South African variant. And in Brazil, it was a combination of the variants. So this suggests that the vaccines can protect against the variants. Now, I want to comment on one thing, that the vaccine, the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, is based on what's called the spike protein of SARS-CoV-2, of COVID-19. It's exactly the same spike gene that was used in the Moderna vaccine and the Pfizer vaccine. So again, this is really encouraging news that the vaccine will protect against the variant. So just to wrap up this very brief presentation, locally, COVID cases continue to decline. However, COVID cases are increasing in many parts of the United States. Other countries are experiencing increasing COVID cases, and some have implemented lockdowns. Cautionary comment there. Variants are circulating in Texas and locally. Preliminary data suggests that existing vaccines offer some protection against the variants. And I think that the important thing to understand here is that the variants will continue to evolve and new variants will continue to emerge. So we really have to keep our eye on the ball when it comes to how these variants are going to spread, how they're going to a great extent. The variants are going to drive in large part the rest of the pandemic. So more news to come on that. But again, I think that there's enough encouraging news here that we should certainly keep. There may be a light at the end of the tunnel, but again, we have to keep up our efforts to really slow down the spread of this virus. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and I will turn it back over to Mark.
Thank you. So on that first slide where you show that the reality is 90% efficacy, does that mean that 10% of the people have gotten COVID, or simply 10% don't have the antibodies? Is it a disease-based or antibody-based? Because it doesn't mean, even if you aren't resistant, that you're going to get it if you maintain the precautions.
Right. So the 90% here refers to actually protection against disease. So basically what they do in these vaccine trials is they have two groups of people. One group has gotten the vaccine, the other group has not gotten the vaccine, and they compare the two groups. And 90% means that the vaccine group had 90% less cases than the placebo group, if you will. So it does protect. Now, the one thing I didn't mention when I was talking about the vaccines is that the Johnson & Johnson vaccine protected against, really, as I showed you, severe disease. There are no deaths in the vaccine group in the Johnson & Johnson vaccine trial. So the important thing here is that not only these vaccines are very effective, and they seem to be very, very effective in preventing severe and critical COVID.
One thing I want to point out to the whole group, and it really struck me, the first meeting we had with you, we really couldn't talk about a vaccine. We didn't know what was going to happen. Here we are, third meeting, and the data I saw today was that 32% of all US citizens have had at least one vaccine, and 75% of people over 65, and I suspect our audience, maybe a higher percentage, have already been vaccinated. And that's amazing. And it's wonderful that our community is at that 75% peak already, and hopefully it'll continue that rapid acceleration.
It's absolutely astonishing, absolutely astonishing, and particularly for the Moderna and the Pfizer vaccines, is a new technology. I don't think anybody anticipated it would be this effective, but it's really been tremendous.
So we have a series of questions about the vaccines, different vaccines, what may be coming. We haven't heard much at all about people who have become ill because of the vaccine. Has there really been anything about people becoming ill because of the vaccine itself? Not with COVID, but other complications. I assume not much, since we're not hearing it.
That's correct. Initially, there were some concerns about allergic reactions to the vaccines. That seems to be quite rare. In a number of studies, the Moderna vaccine, I think the numbers were quoted as 1 in 100,000. I think for the Pfizer vaccine, it was 1 in a million. I mean, these are very, very, very small numbers. There has been some talk about the Astrogenic vaccine. There's been all kinds of problems with the Astrogenic vaccine. Since it's not approved in the United States, I don't think it's worth talking about it. But it seems that the 3 vaccines that we have right now, Moderna, Pfizer, Johnson & Johnson, very effective and a very, very favorable safety profile.
And to reiterate something I think you said, no one who's been vaccinated has subsequently gotten COVID and died. Is that what you said?
In the Johnson & Johnson, and then
The Johnson & Johnson, but still, it's remarkable.
Right, it's remarkable, and the same is true for in the clinical trials. In the clinical trials, the same is true for Pfizer and Moderna.
We want to ask, given that there are several varieties available to people now, again, with more information, more time, is there a preference for certain people should have for one, if they have underlying medical conditions or allergies to vaccines? Is there any reason people should be pursuing a certain one at this point?
My advice is that if you can get a vaccine, get whatever's available. I think people have been fooled by this notion that the Johnson & Johnson vaccine is not quite as effective as Pfizer and Moderna on their clinical trials. The difference was really based on how Johnson & Johnson followed the subjects in their clinical trial. Initially, the report was it had an overall efficacy of 66%. But again, if you narrow it down to those critically ill, the effectiveness in preventing severe disease, the Johnson & Johnson was in the high 80s. So it's essentially the same efficacy. The big benefit, of course, of Johnson & Johnson, 1 dose. So for people who are concerned that whether they'll be available to get the 2nd dose, or they may be traveling or away or whatever, whatever vaccine that you can get your hands on or get your pull up your sleeve for, go ahead and do it.
And if you have a bunch of allergies, it still doesn't matter. There have been very few allergic reactions, so there's no difference, even though we've got different kinds of viruses or different kinds of vaccines.
Right. I mean, the Pfizer and the Moderna vaccines have a number of compounds in them, polyethylene glycol, for example. It's rare for people to have allergic reactions to this. I think the safety profile, as I mentioned before, is really quite strong for both of those, for all 3 of the vaccines.
Can you update us on the current recommendation for people who have had COVID and now are able to get a vaccine? Where do we stand on what they should be doing?
Right. So initially the CDC, and I think it's still the case, is that the option is an option that if you've had COVID and recovered, you can wait 90 days to get your vaccines. That's an option. If you've had COVID and you want to get your vaccine beforehand, go ahead and do it. There are some studies out there that suggest that 1 dose of either Moderna or Pfizer will really boost your immunity if you've had COVID. But right now the recommendations are, if you've had COVID, go ahead and get vaccinated and get 2 vaccines. If you're going for Moderna or Pfizer, of course, the Johnson & Johnson's a single shot.
Another question, I think we've had this before, but regarding people who are allergic, there's no need to pre-medicate with antihistamines or any other drugs. Doesn't matter, doesn't help you.
Right, and there's a lot of comments out there. Well, there are a lot of reports about local site soreness with these vaccines, and some people have said, well, I'll take some ibuprofen or Tylenol beforehand. And that doesn't really make any sense because the reactions typically occur 12 hours or so after you've gotten the vaccine dose. So if you pre-medicate, whatever ibuprofen you have in your system is long gone by the time these side effects arise. So I wouldn't pre-medicate, just go ahead and get vaccinated.
And I've heard that some people are actually being warned against taking ibuprofen and things beforehand.
Right.
Can you explain that to people, what the harm is, if any, or the reasoning?
Well, first of all, you're not going to have any benefit from it. So just on that basis, you shouldn't take it. Ibuprofen is a relatively safe drug, but again, I don't think it's going to benefit you at all. I've heard these things or people ask me about ibuprofen blunting the immune response to the vaccine.
Right.
I don't think there's any basis of that.
Are there any medications people might be taking that either somehow are blunting the effect of the vaccine or vice versa? Taking the vaccine may change the other medications they're taking in a way that they may need to be concerned about changing them or increasing them or whatever, per their doctor, of course.
Not that I know of.
No interactions, good.
Yeah.
People are aware that we can get blood tests to see if we are ultimately immune. Again, I know you're recommending against that. In what state would that be something someone might want to do, see if they actually are immune?
Well, I wouldn't recommend that for a variety of reasons. In the clinical trials, although that a subset of patients or subjects did get blood drawn, what you really want to know about is the effectiveness of the vaccine. The problem with getting a blood test is that you'll get a number back for what your antibody titer is, but we really have no idea of what the protective level is. So if you get a blood test and you find out your blood antibody level is 60 or 420 or 220,000, we have no idea what these numbers mean. So you're going to have to go out of your way to get these kind of tests, and when you get the results, we're really not going to know what that means. So you may be protected at 60, you may not be protected at 400. We don't know, and there are other components of the immune system other than antibodies that help us protect against infection. So even a low antibody titer, a vaccine may induce other parts of the immune system to protect you. So I wouldn't recommend it.
Just the other day, I saw an article that it was sort of disturbing when you first read it. It said that Pfizer has shown that the efficacy of their vaccine is 6 months, which sounds kind of not very good, but then it's important for people to realize that's only because we have 6 months of data, and it may last for 50 years or 12 months. So people need to be cautious when they're seeing that kind of thing, because it is very disconcerting. A lot of people had questions about booster shots, and I do want you to talk about that, but realize that 6 months you might have heard of, that's only the data we have so far. So it's not necessarily a bad piece of information.
Yeah, Mark, you hit the nail on the head here. It's amazing to think that we're into this. We've all been talking about vaccines, but they were just approved less than 5 months ago, and so the clinical trials were just done a little bit before that. So right, we have very, very limited data. Will we need booster shots? We might, and it depends on a couple of things. Depends on the variants, of course. Depends on the durability of the immunity. This virus is not going away. It's going to be with us and circulating year after year after year. We're going to get it under control, but it may be that we may need a booster shot, maybe combined with the flu shot every year, perhaps, but maybe not. Maybe one shot will last a number of years, and in which case we'll just have to get a booster every 5 years, or maybe every 10 years, or adjust it for the variant. So more to follow on that. I think we're in an extraordinary place right now. Here we are 14 months or so, well, actually 16, 18 months into the pandemic, and we have 3 effective vaccines that are now readily available for adults.
On one of your previous lectures, you explained to us the biochemistry of how it worked with the spikes and all that. With some of the variants coming out, are we finding that there are different mechanisms that might be needed for these vaccines, or is it still staying, as you said, that this is less dangerous than the flu in terms of gene mutations causing significant immunity to the vaccine?
Yeah, like with any other virus, these viruses are going to mutate, and as more and more people get immunized, the virus is going to encounter people who have immunities that may force the virus to change a little bit to escape that immunity. This happens with all viruses. Some viruses, that's not a problem. Measles, we've had the same measles vaccine for decades. Some viruses, it's a big problem. Flu is an example. We have to get a new vaccine every year. So the big advantage of the Pfizer and Moderna vaccines is that they can be very, very easily reprogrammed for the variants. Or actually, you can have you can imagine a vaccine, either one of them, or even the Johnson & Johnson vaccine for that matter, that has 3 viruses represented. And in fact, there's a wonderful example of that. The polio vaccine that we use has 3 viruses. There are 3 different types of polio virus. So this is, for vaccines, we're used to these tricks that the viruses play, and we can address them with, again, reprogramming vaccines.
A few people ask, is there any evidence that people are losing immunity? And we only have 6 months under our belt. Are we at this point at least finding that that's not the case to this point?
To this point, there's not seemed to be a loss of immunity. Now, remember, there are a couple of ways you can look at this. You can bleed people and do the test in the test tube. But what we really want to know is somebody who got the vaccine 6 months ago protected against the virus? At this point, it looks like the answer is yes.
We've heard about some people having some long-term sequelae and medical problems having had COVID. It can be blood clots, it can be other things. Some people have pain, some people have prolonged fatigue. Is the vaccine, either beforehand or afterward, making that better in some of those people? Someone asked, is there any improvement because of the vaccines, or do we know yet?
Well, there's what's called the long haulers. These people who have these really long-term, in some cases debilitating consequences of COVID. And in some people, it seems that the vaccine is alleviating some of these symptoms. Now you have to wonder whether a lot of this is just sort of what we call the placebo effect. Maybe they think the vaccine is going to help them, and maybe just because of that, it helps them. But we have to get more data on this. Fortunately, it seems like the people, these long haulers, are a pretty small subset of the total population of people who get COVID.
So with the graphs you showed us and the spikes, I know we're all aware of some of those spikes related to spring break and Christmas holidays, times where we learned as good socially as a group, as a population. But we also heard at the very beginning, maybe the cold weather, the heat would get rid of this. Are we finding any seasonal variation strictly related to the seasons, not to social behavior?
Right. I don't, at this point in time, I don't think there's any seasonality. If you think back to the graph I told you about the 50 states, it's the places that are having difficulties with the virus right now are not all in the north, and the states that are doing well in the south. And again, if you look at different countries, there doesn't seem to be seasonality. Now, it may evolve that this becomes a seasonal virus, but at this point in time, don't count on the warm weather solving our problems. That was a lot of talk about that a year ago. Well, the warm weather is going to solve our problems. It didn't solve our problems.
And someone was asking an interesting question. Are we finding, as more people are getting vaccinated, that the spread of the disease is finding a different way to reach people? Not so much by touch, but are there different ways where we're finding the disease is having little outbursts because of the vaccine in other areas protecting people?
Right. It seems like the one thing that the vaccine has shown us is that over the last several weeks to months or so, the people who are coming down with COVID tend to be in younger age groups. And this sort of makes a lot of sense because initially when the vaccines were rolled out, the people who were eligible were not only the people with underlying medical conditions, but older individuals. And in many states that age cutoff has been decreasing. So as you mentioned before, Mark, I think 75% of people over a certain age have been immunized. So the fact that we're seeing the shift to younger populations suggests two things. One, of course, the vaccine seems to be working in older people. That's great news. The concerning news is that the younger people who maybe are less, or a little bit more lax, if you will, in their social distancing measures and mask wearing, are now starting to get infected. And some of these cases, that some of these people are quite sick. It could be the variants, but it does suggest that this shifting dynamic, if you will, suggests that the vaccine actually is working. And it also suggests that there are certain age groups who are particularly prone to the virus simply because of their behavior.
Well, now early on, we were told that the young people in general tolerated being sick better. Is that changing, or simply more of them are getting it? So we do have a few more that are sick, but they still tolerate it as a population better than the older ones.
Yeah, I think it's the latter. I think that for the most part, younger people tend to do better, but now that there are more young people getting infected, now we're starting to see greater numbers of people with severe disease.
So talk, if you can, a little bit. People are not concerned, but are interested now that they are vaccinated. What is the issue has become political here in the nation, the green passport. And for those who don't know what a green passport is, I think Israel may have started it, but it's basically a card that says, I have been vaccinated, which in theory would let you into certain businesses or let you travel. There's a lot of controversy about it because some people think it's discriminatory. We're not going to that, but what is your understanding at this point in our world, the United States, about, is that something that the medical world is pushing for? What are your thoughts on it? Tell us what you can about the green passport, the magic green passport.
Yeah, we do know, and I mean the CDC now has put out their guidance as far as now vaccinated individuals can get together without social distancing, without wearing a mask. Vaccinated individuals no longer need to quarantine if they've been exposed, as long as they're asymptomatic. And so it certainly suggests again that these vaccines work very, very well. And I think this, the green passport, as you said, it's taken on a sort of some political momentum, but it seems to me it makes a lot of sense. I think any one of us would feel a lot more comfortable if we're part of a crowd going to Anshai on a Friday night, knowing that everybody there has been immunized. So I think it makes a lot of sense. And mind you, we have vaccine restrictions for school, and we've had that for decades now. So this concept of a vaccine allowing us to partake in certain parts of society is nothing new. And I think it's actually a pretty good idea, politics aside, that we have a good sense of who's out there and what's going on. I mean, hopefully we'll get this thing under control so we won't need this. But I think over the next several months, maybe half a year or so, this sort of vaccine passport may be something that's very, very valuable.
So we're going to switch to a topic you alluded to just a minute ago, children, and you're a pediatrician, of course. Are you, from a practical point of view, seeing more children with COVID right now because of what you alluded to, that it's tending toward that population?
Well, what we're seeing in pediatrics, we see two different types of COVID in children. One is the respiratory tract disease that's very similar to what's being seen in adults. And the other disease, and it's a new disease now, is what's called multisystem inflammatory syndrome in children. It's this horrible inflammatory disease that we're seeing in children about a month after they've had COVID. And in most cases, that COVID disease was actually quite mild or completely asymptomatic. And we're seeing children who are presenting with horrible inflammation, with heart failure, who end up in our ICUs. And in fact, we're seeing, I saw a number of these kids today now in follow-up who've recovered. So the numbers are smaller in children. Fortunately, this inflammatory syndrome is quite rare, although we do see it. But the issue of children is something very interesting, and that is that, of course, right now, the vaccines are only available for individuals greater than 16 or over for Pfizer, 18 and over for Moderna and Johnson & Johnson. We're never going to get to that beautiful herd immunity that a lot of people talk about. I think few people understand, but we're not going to get to that unless we start immunizing children. And because children, the population of individuals in this country less than 18 years of age represent about a quarter of the population. So until we immunize children, we're never going to get there. So
what is the? I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, Pfizer put out some data suggesting that their vaccine works very well in 12-year-olds and up to 15-year-old, filling in a gap. And Moderna has trials going on. Johnson & Johnson has trials going on, but we're probably not going to get to see vaccinations in children probably till summertime, which is not bad because for the next school year, starting in August or September, we may have vaccines available for children, for at least older children. And again, that would make it safer for them to go back to school.
So the issue isn't policy or availability, it's testing. That for that age, we've got to get approval. It's right. A different parameter than older people of our age or older than 18 or older than 16 in this case.
That's great. That's right.
Okay, so they're hurrying as much as they can, but obviously we're on a hold there.
Right.
So some people have asked, and interestingly, for all these months coming up, we're curious about what we can do to protect ourselves, the older population, the middle-aged population. We had several questions. Now, what do we need to do to protect those under 16? Should we not be going around them? Should we be not hugging them? Even though we don't have the disease, we've been vaccinated, but what should we do to protect those kids that are still in our world or in our home?
Right. So the CDC does say that if you've been vaccinated, you could certainly be around people, unvaccinated children who are at low risk. And who are asymptomatic, of course. And so I certainly agree with that. And for people who have grandchildren, they want to go see their grandchildren, go ahead. That's the CDC said that's fine. So from a person who's been immunized, be mindful of the fact that the vaccines are very effective, but they're not 100%. Fortunately, the preliminary data suggests that the vaccines may protect against asymptomatic infection. In other words, somebody who's been vaccinated won't unknowingly get infected and then transmit the virus to others. But still be careful. If you've been immunized and you're thinking about being around somebody who may be particularly susceptible to COVID, a young child with an immune disorder or a child who's on chemotherapy or what have you, I would be very cautious about a immunized individual being in close contact with somebody who may be at high risk.
So I'm going to hold your feet to the fire. Use the verb, it's okay to see your grandchildren. The questions we had were about hugging my grandchildren, kissing my grandchildren. So that's what Bubbies and Zeddies want to do. So given that you're vaccinated and your kid is healthy, hugging, kissing,
it's okay. It's okay. It may, as long as right. It's okay. Again, making sure they're not symptomatic. They haven't been exposed to somebody who's been symptomatic. But yes, go ahead.
Okay. We do have a population out there of our seniors and of our general population, people who cannot be vaccinated or have chosen not to. And that brings up, as you mentioned, the term herd immunity. But they have some specific concerns, especially the ones that cannot be vaccinated, that no matter what, because of other medical conditions. So if you can explain to everybody what herd immunity is, the concept of it, if you will, and what those people should be doing, the ones who can't get vaccinated even if they wanted to, let alone choose not to.
Right. So herd immunity is a concept in epidemiology that suggests that once you achieve a certain percentage of the population that becomes immune to a virus, and that immunity can be either through natural infection or through vaccination, you get to a point where you have basically considerably diminished or eliminated the spread of the virus. I wouldn't say eliminated, but really curtailed the spread of the virus. So, for example, we have reached herd immunity for measles. We don't see any cases of measles. Occasionally, there'll be measles that come into the country and there'll be small outbreaks. But now that we have such a large percentage of the population that has been immunized against measles, when measles enters the population, it really can't spread. So, in general terms, that's what herd immunity is. Now, herd immunity depends on, it's different for each virus, and it depends how infectious each virus is. So for a virus like measles, you really have to get a very high percentage of people immunized, because measles is the most contagious virus that we know of. COVID is pretty high there, up there too, not as high as measles. So the projections are that we need 75 to 80% of the population immune before we get to that nirvana point where we can say, all right, the virus is under control. There may be sporadic outbreaks here and there, but it's gonna be under control. So we're nowhere close to that. As I mentioned before, we're not immunizing kids. Even when we start immunizing kids, we have to see how the virus evolves and mutates. But you know, I think we're a long way away from that, and we may get to the point where we never reach that. You know, we have flu vaccines every year because we've just never gotten to the point where the virus keeps evolving and we keep trying to catch up to the virus, and that's why we haven't got herd immunity.
One of our esteemed medical colleagues piped in a note that to his knowledge, there are no medical conditions in which a person cannot be vaccinated. And I'm talking about people on chemotherapy. Is that true? Though? Even people who are currently on chemotherapy, immunocompromised, are you aware of anything that people can't be vaccinated?
Right. So there's no there's no contraindication to vaccination, with the exception of if you have an allergic reaction to one of the components. That's very, 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 very unusual. So I guess the real question is, if you have somebody who's on chemotherapy or they're on immunosuppressive therapy, maybe they're a transplant recipient, it's not as if they can't get the vaccine. The question is, will they respond to the vaccine because they're so immunosuppressed? That's an interesting question. And we don't know how well the vaccine works in individuals who have suppressed immunity. So by all means, these individuals should get the vaccine. There may be certain circumstances where, for whatever reason or another, a provider may hesitate, but that's an individual case. But right, the only contraindication right now is just a severe allergy to the vaccine, and as I said, that's really very, very
okay. So if anyone out there has been told they can't have it, revisit that with your doctor, because that may not be correct. And we're learning things as we go.
right.
You mentioned, and we all I hear about these cases of measles popping up, even though we've been vaccinated. Even polio pops up. Obviously, these viruses, all of these, including this one, exist in other forms and other vectors. We heard about this being in mink and in bats. What are they finding in terms of trying to control this in the big picture and maybe eradicating it in terms of, I'm sure there are people working on that end of it.
Right. So it's clear right now that the origin of this virus is in bats. Bats harbor a lot of viruses. The first SARS coronavirus was identified in bats. there was what we call an intermediate host, which was a palm civet that got the virus and then transmitted to humans. There's another coronavirus called MERS, which has popped up in the Middle East. This is also found in bats. It was transmitted through camels. We haven't figured out what the intermediate host yet for SARS-CoV-2, the cause of COVID. It's going to be impossible to eliminate these viruses from their natural reservoir. And there are thousands of different types of coronaviruses in bats. Bats harbor other nasty viruses, rabies, Ebola, and others. So the way to get this under control, two ways. Of course, one is to immunize as much as you can, and two is to really restrict the exposure between wild animals and humans. And that tends to be more common in China, where they have the live markets and there's a lot more interaction between animals and humans. So, we're going to have to fight this as we fight every other battle with viruses, and that's going to be with the vaccination.
So since we've established that really nobody can't be vaccinated, if for some reason someone out there chooses not to be, would your recommendation be like we at the start? You need to stay away from people. You need to wear your mask when you do go out, kind of like we all behaved at the beginning.
Right. You have to, you put yourself at risk. And I think it's always important to think about, when you have a choice, what's the risk-benefit ratio of either of the options? Well, if you decide to get immunized, what's the risk? Well, the risk now seems that you may have some local tenderness. Maybe you won't feel so great for a day or two. That's the risk. The benefit, of course, is that you'll be protected. If you decide not to get vaccinated, what's your risk? Well, your risk is that you may get COVID. And we're seeing serious COVID in all age groups, including children. We know it's a deadly disease. 555,000 Americans have died of COVID right now. So you have to understand the risks, and of course, not only to yourself but those around you, particularly household contacts. So think about the risk-benefit ratio is something that you just focus on. And to me, there's an obvious benefit to getting vaccine than being susceptible to COVID.
The next broad category I want to do is really some specific questions pertaining to living our lives moving forward as vaccinated people. Obviously, I think we all know that if we're going to go on vacation and we're going to be hiking alone in the woods, that's better than being in a convention center with 300 of our best friends 2 feet away. That being said, and all things being equal, should people be looking at the data from each state saying, well, New York may not be the best place to go, but I'm okay in Delaware? Or is it sort of, go ahead and do what you're going to do, just use the precautions that are broad?
Yeah, I think it's, go what you're going to do, be wise, use the precautions. I mean, I certainly wouldn't go to any given state based on the tiles I showed you, because that tends to morph pretty quickly. I wouldn't go to a baseball game or a concert in any one of the states, whether you're the green or the red. I wouldn't do that. On the other hand, the CDC says you can travel now, domestically. You're going to travel. You're going to wear your mask. You're going to wear eye protection. And if you've been vaccinated, you're pretty much guaranteed to be safe. And again, of course, what you do at your destination, the same rules apply. But things are opening up a little bit, and with the necessary precautions, you can really be safe.
So, kind of a tough question, maybe, but we're saying that if you're vaccinated, you're safe, and if you're not going to be around people, why can't you go to a baseball game? I mean, what is your risk if you're in a baseball game, but you are fully vaccinated, you've had your 2 weeks, you're doing fine? Why not?
Well, I mean, it all depends on as I mentioned before, the vaccine's not 100%. So there's a chance that you may fall into that 10% where your vaccine, you didn't respond to the vaccine. And that's number one. Of course, we don't know the durability of the vaccine. In other words, we're learning that more and more, but the durability is an average. So for some people right now, maybe 6 months, maybe for others, maybe a little less. We don't know about the variants. Remember, when we study these variants, we're always weeks behind. We're looking at samples that were taken a few weeks ago, and we're doing the analysis. So we're always weeks behind. So for all we know, there may be a new variant out there today, which we're not going to discover for the next couple of weeks. That's been flying under our radar. So if you're going to go to a ball game or to a concert, yeah, the things are in your favor. But if there's a new variant circulating that we don't understand yet, you're putting yourself at risk. So It's all a matter of, whatever risk you want to tolerate. And I use this unfortunate metaphor a lot. I said, people drive after a couple of drinks. That's pretty common. Eventually it's going to catch up to you. Either you get in a car accident or you get pulled over by police, whatever. But if you keep doing that risky behavior, eventually the odds catch up to you. And right now we don't know the odds, so you have to remain cautious.
So let's talk about summer vacation here in the United States. People want to know, can I go on vacation somewhere? Can I fly? And some of these things are covered in the CDC, but let's talk about being on a bus trip. A lot of seniors like bus trips, that sort of a thing, or going to national parks, that sort of thing. Tell us your recommendations and how they jive with the CDC about how people should go forward this upcoming summer.
Yeah. So
or how they may, because people want to, obviously.
Right. So that would be a lot easier question for me to answer if there was this vaccine passport, because then you could say, all right, I'm going to go on a trip. Everybody's been vaccinated on the bus. I'm good. And I think that, traveling as far as groups are concerned, we'll have a pretty good idea in the next couple of months how safe that is. Again,
the hard way, maybe.
I'm sorry?
Maybe the hard way, though.
Oh, we may learn the hard way, yes. All the more reason to practice these safe behaviors. So if you're thinking about going away, certain national parks, of course, you'll be outside, and I think the risk there is pretty low if you've been immunized. For people who are going to be in close quarters, you got to wear a mask. You got to wear eye protection. And, the advice, the answer to that question may be different a month from now or 2 months from now in either direction. So we don't know. But right now, I think that if tomorrow you're thinking about taking a flight, go ahead and do that. Wear a mask and eye protection.
And if you're planning on taking a bus trip, you might at least talk to the operators, see what regulations or what criteria they're accepting, or consider that a little more seriously, because you don't know what those people are, what their status is in terms of vaccination.
Right.
So that's the United States. Now let's talk about people who want to either travel internationally, not only the longer flights, but also where they're going, and also in that same vein, cruising. Tell us your thoughts on those options. There's a lot of people like to do those things.
Right. So as far as international travel, a lot of that's going to be dictated by the countries that you're thinking of going to. I don't think you can get into France very well right now. You can't get into Canada and a number of other countries. So a lot of that's going to be dictated by the country that you may be thinking of traveling to. So you check with that. The CDC has a wonderful, they have a lot of wonderful websites in COVID, but you can actually see what the risk is for each country. And I can share that link with everybody, but you can actually, it's updated pretty frequently. I mean, right now, most of the countries are so-called red because the CDC doesn't recommend international travel. As far as cruises are concerned, that is a bit of a wild card because some of these cruises, as you know, may visit different countries. People get on and get off. And you don't know what the restrictions are in those other countries. I think I would be a little cautious with cruising. Now, I'm sure there are cruises. I know there are cruises that only stop at domestic ports. But again, you're going to be in close quarters. I would be a little bit resistant to that right now. I would hesitate a little bit, but again, that could change over the next few months.
Another thing a lot of people are doing are small group activities, mahjong, bridge, dancing. And the way I look at it, there's sort of two different groups. There's those where we have physical contact. We're dancing or we're sharing mahjong tiles where I may touch it, then you touch it, or bridge cards or whatever, as opposed to, say, we're going to a lecture, or choir may not be the right thing because we're singing, but groups where we're together in small groups having a service at Shul. So tell us about where you stand on those kind of activities, both the ones with some possible contact versus the ones where we're together in a small group, but larger than we've been doing.
Right. So again, the CDC, if you're going to be in a small group setting, excuse me, everybody's been immunized, you can behave like you did before the pandemic. In other words, if you're sitting playing mahjong or cards with a group of people, everybody's been immunized. There's no risk there. There's no contact. If you want to sit around with a group of 8 or 10 people and enjoy a meal, that's fine. That's fine. So any one of these activities, as long as everybody's been immunized, and of course that nobody's symptomatic, go ahead and get together. So I think that's fine.
Touching, dancing with 12 partners in a roundabout, no problem.
Go ahead.
Have at it. Very good.
Have fun.
Give you a chance to drink there. So that's good news for a lot of people. We've got a Mahjong group at the show. I know we've got people who do other things. So I think people would be excited to hear that. Tell us your opinion now on eating inside a restaurant. For the longest time, we've been eating outside or taking it home if we go out at all. So where do you stand on a restaurant?
Well, this is a bit tricky because not all restaurants are created equal. I think at this point, outside dining is still preferable. There was a report that came out just a day or two ago about a large outbreak of COVID that was traced back to a bar someplace in Illinois. And a lot of people who were there were exposed and got infected, and they infected family members. And it was a real mini outbreak, if you will. So restaurants still tend to be a place where there is some risk. And of course, here in Texas, there's no longer restrictions about capacity. So I would be a little cautious with that. I mean, again, I think outside dining is a good idea, but being in a big crowded restaurant, I would pause at considering that.
And I think last time you told us you weren't concerned so much about the preparation, the food handling, but the environment. Is that still the same thing? It's not the getting the food, it's who you're sitting with and in the environment with our mouths uncovered.
That's correct.
Okay, thank you. Someone was asking about what's the status regarding all our lives, but especially with travel or those kind of things, double masking. Is double masking appropriate in certain circumstances or when we're flying or all the time? What's the best thing to do?
Well,
I guess improve every chance of being healthy, staying healthy.
Right. So it all depends on what type of masks you're using. I mean, if you're using two cloth masks combined, they may not give you much benefit over one. And I think that's true for the most part. But get a good mask. And with some of the surgical masks, certainly with the N95 type masks, you really don't need a second mask. So get a good mask. And again, if you don't happen to have a good mask, then double masking that's fine too.
When we started out with the vaccine, at least here in Dallas, I know everywhere really, the issue was supply. We didn't have a lot of it. As we're progressing and getting our 75% of the older people and 32%, and vaccines are much more available, are we still finding that the issue with getting the general population immunized is the supply, or is it now just a matter of the interest, or is that, do you think that's going to accelerate? We're going to get a larger percentage quickly? Yeah,
I think we're shifting to a supply issue, to sort of a demand issue, or maybe the other way around. But I mean, right now, we're getting to the point now where, at least maybe by the end of this month, anybody who is eligible to get a vaccine should be able to get a vaccine, or at least get on a list for a vaccine. And then we're going to be up against where we have vaccine available and people don't want it. I think there are a lot of people who are holding out just to see what happens. And I think that people, maybe in a month from now, knowing that all their friends have gotten vaccinated, all their family has gotten vaccinated, that they just feel more comfortable now that they have some, information that maybe the vaccine is safer than I thought it was. So we'll see. I think there's all kinds of reports out there about people who are reluctant to get the vaccine, but that may change.
I know that some of our audience has actually volunteered at some of the large centers, helping getting people through the paperwork and all vaccinating. To your knowledge, are the crowds still coming for the vaccines, or are we hitting that point where we have to mobilize our population a little better?
No, I think we're still at the point where there are people waiting online for a vaccine.
Okay, that's a good thing.
Yeah. And I passed the line today in Parkland Hospital, so there's still demand for the vaccine.
So we're winding down, I think, here. I don't have a whole lot more questions. Tell us where you imagine we'll be in 6 months, and it sounds like from talking to you, some of the key factors will we get the kids vaccinated? We'll be able to and then do it at the same time continue the adult population. But where do you think we'll be in 6 months, and what are the key factors to make continuing this progress?
Right. I always hesitate to make predictions, but I would say that hopefully in 6 months we've got this virus under control. There'll be a low level of spread of the virus, that there'll be local outbreaks, particularly among populations that refused vaccination or couldn't get vaccinated or were eligible to get vaccinated. And we'll see this pop up sporadically around the country. It could be that we may need another booster dose. And of course, that's a logistical challenge. Rolling out another set of vaccine. So I'm hopeful that in the next 6 months, 6 months from now, we'll be at a much better place, much better control. We'll be able to mobilize public health officials to areas where there are outbreaks, and do the types of things that can be done when the numbers come down, contact tracing and that type of thing. So I'm hopeful. Again, I'm a little worried that the next few months may be a little rough, because I think everybody has really wanted to put this pandemic behind them. I think we may be loosening up a little bit too soon, but we'll see.
We have one final set of questions here. Someone referenced an article that came out on NPR. There was talk about a magic vaccine that'll be good for all variants, and there were talk about different ones. There's a nasal one, and there's a pill, and all that. My understanding would be we can't know something that's going to be universal. We never know what mutations might be. Is that correct?
That's
What's
correct.
going on in terms of other vaccines being, manufactured, being studied? What's different about them than the ones we have, if anything?
Right. So there are a number of investigators and companies looking at vaccines that are a little bit logistically more easy. So you can imagine a vaccine that's a pill, a vaccine that's a nasal spray, rather than going someplace and getting an injection. To me, the real issue is, does the vaccine work? And we have 3 vaccines now that work remarkably well. So the bar is pretty high. If you want to develop a vaccine that is a pill, well, go ahead and try it, but it's got to be it's got to be 90% effective. So that's the bar right now. I don't, and this whole concept that we're going to have a universal vaccine against all the variants, that may happen. But look at influenza. We've been looking for a universal flu vaccine for decades now. That's the holy grail, and we haven't found it yet. So, it's nice to think about these ideal vaccines, but we're in a great spot right now when it comes to vaccines. And the fact that these can be reprogrammed very easily for the variants, we can easily stay ahead of the virus here. I mean, I didn't believe a year ago, I would not have imagined that we would be here early April, 3 terrific vaccines, and ready to start, moving forward and putting this pandemic behind us. So quite astonishing.
Well, even 6 months ago, we all look at the progress. None of us back then might have gone to the gym or gone to a friend's house or gone outside to eat. It has been remarkable, and lives are returning to normal, but we're not there yet. And we said that all along, but we've got to go for the long haul.
Yeah, be patient.
Well, Jeff, I don't have any more questions for you. We appreciate it again very much, all your insight. And as I think Dan said at the beginning, or maybe Phil, hopefully there won't be a 4th one. But on the other hand, we know you'll be available for us when we have more questions in the near future as things change.
Thank you, Mark.
Phil, I'm going to turn it back over to you.
Jeff, thank you very much. Mark, thank you very much. Appreciate everybody showing up, and I hope you all enjoyed it and learned something. Dan, you have anything else to add to that? I guess not. So with that, why don't we say adieu and see you down the road, maybe at the synagogue for Shabbat services in a few weeks.